for people that want a brief introduction, I do recommend the book by J.E. King. It gives a really easy to read introduction. Some of the key points listed on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side of this slide, but wanted to point out that when we're talking about the environment and ecological sustainability, there's quite a lot missing here. So post-Keynesian economics is empirically accurate and really good for sort of looking at the economic system in a demand-driven nature, but doesn't have much to say about technology. It doesn't have much to say about ecological limits. This is partly because at the time when Keynes was developing the theory, the environment wasn't, well, we weren't really looking at these ecological limits because there was the war rationing and how to allocate production, which he was interested in. But it's only much more recently that we've come to think about pure ecological limits. And it's probably fair to say Keynes would have been interested in it if he was doing all of this now. But point is, we need to look a bit further than pure Keynesian theory. Fortunately, we have the evolutionary school and more recently complexity, a few examples of really good works to look at on the right-hand side. It's really changing the way of thinking. We're talking about a low carbon transition. Transition means change. This change is mostly going to be driven by technology. Now, I don't want to say technology is the answer to everything, but we're certainly not going to get very far without it. So we do need to understand how technology develops, how technology gets into the system, and really these are the theories that we're drawing upon to do that. Okay, and then the last one, ecological limits, really talking about the constraints. Again, some works that we've been pulling on, original limits to growth and Georgescu-Roegen and entropy, both from the early 1970s, and then more recently I saw questions about the donut had already come up in the questions, but certainly easier to read than Georgescu-Roegen. Let's put it that way. But yeah, we do have to respect these constraints. They are real. We can't just assume them away, and they are a lot of the reasons that we are doing the research and the analysis that we're doing. So really trying to get this a core part of the modeling is quite important, and I'll show in a few slides time exactly how we've been going about doing that. So last slide on the theory, you can tell I made this diagram myself rather than from any designer. Been thinking about how to represent these three distinct strands of theory in a single diagram. And it's, okay, we've got the circle on the outside, which is the ecological boundaries. I think most people would agree with that. But then on the inside, we've got an economy that's trying to grow, and it tries to grow naturally because of heterogeneity, companies competing with each other, people competing with each other, which is leading to innovation, process innovation and product innovation, which have completely different types of economic impacts and environmental impacts. But when you put them together, you get economic growth over time. And then, of course, how that impacts on jobs and unemployment and other key economic indicators. So we've got a system that's trying to grow inside these limits, but the limits are fixed, they're not moving. And while technology has some influence, we have these basic constraints that we can't get around. So that's the basic thinking. Now, of course, the question is how to put that into the model, and now it gets a bit more complicated. Now, this slide definitely is from our marketing department. It's much nicer than anything I could produce. There's a basic schematic of the E3ME model, looking at the different modules. We put technology right at the key because technology is so core and it cuts across all the different areas that we're looking at, so the economy, the environmental system, but other things as well. But then I think the key part of this diagram is really the linkages between the different boxes. There are lots of models that look at each one in isolation, but getting everything consistent, and it's involved mixing economic and physical unit, so sort of systems dynamics type approach. This is what's really important, having a representation of the economy that's consistent with the physical world in which it operates. And that's really what has always been the core strength of the model. I'll do one slide on each of the three areas of theory. So the economics first, standard national accounting representation, demand driven by nature of the sort of the big arrow going from the top right to the bottom left, showing that it is the level of aggregate demand that determines the level of output, with supply adjusting unless there are constraints to do so. And I think there's some quite strong parallels with presentation from Jens here. It's very much a demand-driven system. For maybe more standard CG-focused people to how to get the level of output, you could think of it as a sort of big multiplier exercise, but you've got the input-output table on the top left. But you make final demand endogenous as well, of course, as prices sitting on top of this, but then go around this loop repeatedly until it converges to a steady state outcome with supply and demand being equal. That's roughly how it solves. Similar to a multiplier if you did it iteratively rather than inverting the matrix. Technology evolution, I have to refer to my longtime co-author, Jean-Francois Mercure here, who developed these models. The two key curves are the ones at the top right. The S-shaped diffusion, which we've already heard about, and this is from competing technologies. Investors having the choice of technology, choosing the one that's not just necessarily the cheapest, but the one that they know about, has cost advantages. Again, heterogeneity absolutely key in determining this. The learning curves, which most people are familiar with, as the costs come down over time as the technologies get adopted. You put those two things together, when you get to that steep part of the S-shaped curve, you can get rapid transition. And really what a lot of we're doing in the modeling is trying to identify the policies that make things happen quickly by hitting the right part of those curves. So we can't do this for every sector of the economy. That would require knowing every single technology in existence, and we're not there yet, whatever. But we do have it for the key sectors in terms of emissions, so power sector, cars, steel, and buildings. And gradually, as time goes on, that list is getting longer. But this, again, putting technology at the center of it, I think, is really quite important. Ecological constraints. Now here it's more difficult because there are questions about data. There's questions about defining the constraints. The charts show the supply curves for energy resources, including renewable annual flows, but on the left, and the fossil fuel limited stocks on the right. We would really love to get something similar for sort of the key material types, especially questions that are coming up with rare earths and things like that, could be really important. But even then, I think we're still very much aware that there are ecological constraints that we're missing. Especially once you get into topics such as biodiversity, and the idea is that it's the extraction of the materials and the damage to ecosystems that is really harming our environment, rather than just the consumption of the resources. So I think here it's fair to say there is quite a lot more to do. Right, see how I'm doing on time. So some results. What does this all mean? So starting off with a chart that maybe some of you are familiar with from the IPCC 5th assessment report, looking at the costs of meeting a 2-degree target compared to a baseline. And the chart on the right-hand side is basically taken from the model database that was used with all the runs of all the integrated assessment models getting to 2 degrees. And it looks very positive because it's all bars going upwards, some of them quite high, but in fact, it's a chart of costs. So it's taken a negative light. And you can see that every single model, with one exception in 100, which I admit I've never actually found out what that was or how they did it. But the models are just showing and estimates of costs, and the narrative that comes out of this is basically costs. And the aim of policy is to try to minimize these costs, which is in fact what the models are doing. They're aiming to minimize these costs. Now that comes basically straight out of neoclassical economics, looking at ways of optimizing a system. Your baseline is optimized, your 2-degree scenarios are constrained. Optimized systems say by nature things can only get worse. Now, if we drop the assumptions about optimization, and this is effectively coming straight from Keynes' original work, because there's uncertainty, we're unable to optimize behavior because there are things we just don't know about. And a more simulation-based approach from E through ME doesn't necessarily lead to these costs. And here's one example from European Commission study, which was looking at getting to 2-degree target for the EU by the year 2050. And the table at the bottom is showing 5 different scenarios, all of which get to minus 80% emissions for the EU, run with 2 different models, E through ME, the Cambridge model. The top row, GEMI3 is a CG neoclassical model. And you can see they've got to opposite results, basically because of these assumptions about capacity within the economy. If there's spare capacity, like E through ME says, boost it with investment, use that capacity, GDP increases. If you have the crowding out, like in the CG models, then you lose the investment from elsewhere. That's what was really interesting when Jens presented that this crowding out isn't there, because absolutely critical to the results that come out of the model. Now, this is what has now been adopted as the EU's long-term strategy. Cañete was the head of DG Climate Action at the European Commission at the time. And there was tons of modeling work that went into long-term strategy using a whole range of different models. But we were quite surprised in Cambridge when this tweet came out, which was basically the E through ME results put into Twitter, and they're focusing on the GDP benefits and the particular benefits for the EU from reducing energy imports. That even though the other modeling was finding the opposite results, this is what they decided to go with, the sort of the headline results, and you can see the FT was reporting on it as well. So certainly benefits for the EU from that, and it's not just a story of EU benefits because it imports a lot of energy. At global level, you can see this because what we're effectively doing is changing the trajectory of technology, and it's not we go to a world where it's the same, but there are some costs. We're going to a different world. It is a set of different sets of means of production based on different technologies. And whether that comes out better or worse just depends on the nature of the technologies that you use. So this was the new climate economy report, which got presented at the UN headquarters 2 or 3 years ago. And that's all the macro outcomes. I did want to add this to focus on carbon taxes. Once we drop the assumptions of perfect markets don't always become the best outcomes. So these stories about carbon taxes solving all the problems, we have to get away from this narrative. It really is not helpful. What we need is policies that develop the technologies at each stage of the innovation cycle. Now, carbon taxes are important towards the end of that cycle, but they don't really help much earlier on. So we need a mix of policies, and the interaction of policies is really important here. So there's more detail in that post, which I should have added the link to. So key conclusions, because I'm sure I'm running out of time already. Different modeling approaches. So there is this basic divide between optimization and simulation. Now, what I've been presenting is very much a simulation-based approach. We put the policies in, we see how it changes technology trajectories, what it means for the economy. Now, that's a long way away from the sorts of questions that are like, what's the best way to get to this particular outcome? We wouldn't be able to do that with the framework we have. Now, I'm often quite critical about the optimized based approaches. In principle, there is nothing wrong with it as long as you apply it to the right type of question. And it's when you start to apply the wrong modeling approach to the wrong type of question, that's when we can get into trouble. And unfortunately, sometimes neoclassical economics does obscure this and lead us in the wrong direction. So I think that's the first point, this fundamental difference. But even going beyond that, all modeling approaches have limitations and assumptions. Of course they do. They are approximations of reality, and we have to make assumptions to get to those approximations. If we didn't do that, our model would just be the whole world. There's responsibility on the modelers to make sure they're not pushing against these assumptions. So they're using their modeling tools in a responsible way. Now, I think we're all guilty of pushing that sometimes. But at the very least, we need to make as clear as possible the basis for these assumptions and how the impact on results. But I think there is also something here for the people that use the results of the models and how they're interpreted. But last point I want to make, which I'm sure will resound very well with rethinking economics, that there is benefits from what we're seeing quite often now is running different models side by side and comparing the results. Now, this is not just an academic exercise because it does yield policy insights as well. I just finished with one example from the European Union on energy efficiency policy. They ran a CGE model alongside the Cambridge Keynesian model, and they got, as I showed previously, negative impact from the CGE model, positive impacts from the Keynesian model. And he said, well, what do we need to do to get the positive results? And one very simple example is, well, tell the producers of all the equipment that there is going to be demand for it so they can increase capacity in time so that they can increase production without any crowding out, without other activities going on, and just give that message so that it can happen. And that's the sort of thing that pluralism can really help to bring out, adding details to the results. Further information, lots of links here. More than happy to share all the slides, and of course any questions even after the discussion, please do bring them back to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hector. Thank you for your presentation. And while the audience prepares their questions and send them to us in the Q&A model that you find in the bottom of your screen, and please indicate if there's one of the presenters you'd like to particularly to answer your question. And while we receive the questions, Jens, do you have a short remark for Hector's, based on Hector's presentation? And I would love to you have some reflections on the innovation approach and also the policy approach and the CO2 tax. In Denmark, there was a large advertised model results a few weeks ago that said that most policies besides the CO2 tax would be very costly, so we shouldn't do much else. So this seems like there's a different approach here. What's your thought?
Was that to me or to? Yeah.
Yes, so if you want to get into that discussion of the CO2 tax, but also Hector's presentation.
Let me just comment on Hector's presentation first. Well, thank you very much. And I think this seminar we sort of pitched against each other a little bit. Like I'm the mainstream guy, I think, the bad one maybe. But when I look at your model and I've read the documentation and all that, it doesn't seem that different from what we are doing, actually, with the dynamics and you have like it's I mean obviously it's a different type of model, it being a macroeconometric model, but sort of the dynamics of it seems quite similar to what we are doing. So perhaps I should call my model a post-Keynesian model. What do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Yes, we are supposed to have an argument, but there are more. But there are more similarities, and actually that was going to be my question. How the term CGE is getting stretched a bit. I would say when some of the examples you gave, there are things that are quite clearly not in equilibrium, at least as equilibrium in terms of full capacity being reached.
Sure.
So in that sense, no, I agree. And the other thing I was going to say, which I think is important, is it probably wouldn't be a fair fight anyway, because I just showed a slide where there were 30 years of history, and you guys started 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think it's to have come that far and be pushing outside the sort of just the standard CGE, which in that sort of time would be much easier to do, I think is something that we really should appreciate.
Great, and by all means, I'm happy to see you get along well. We're not hoping to host a cockfight or anything. So this is good to see. Let's move to the Q&A session. I think we'll start with Christopher Proctor. He's asking Hector. Oh, Christopher, do you want to say it yourself? Let me see if I can find you. I've invited you to speak if you'd like to. I think so. Let's see if I can find you in the participants list. Just a moment. We'd like to get the audience involved. Okay, yeah, there we are.
There, looks like I'm unmuted.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, J. Christopher Proctor, a PhD student at the University of Technology of Compiègne in France. And I wanted to ask about the question of long-term growth paths within these post-Keynesian models, particularly. So I come from a post-Keynesian macro background where one of the main things that you sort of learn is that there is undercapacity within the economy, even in the long run. And so if you have these big investment increases, then in theory, you should be able to go onto a different growth path and have much higher economic growth, even in the longer run. But it seems like at least what I've been able to see from the Cambridge econometrics model, there's more of a U-shaped growth curve, where in the short run, there's a lot of new growth associated with the energy transition. But then by 2050, a lot of that growth has not even just gone down in terms of growth rates, but actually reverted back to the mean as if there had not been a transition in the first place. And I guess I just wanted to check and see, is my understanding of that result correct? And if so, what is driving that, and how does that fit with sort of the rest of post-Keynesian macro?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I can see you referring to a 2019 paper. Is that the chart with the red and the green?
Yes, exactly. And it's this beautiful
I
chart.
like that chart.
It's a beautiful chart, but then you sort of get the post-Keynesian and the neoclassical models agreeing in the end. And I was just kind of curious about that effect.
Yeah, I mean the chart is quite stylized. It's basically looking at a low carbon transition. So early on, you have the investment because we need to build a lot of renewables, energy efficiency stuff, and that boosts investment, which exactly as you say draws on the spare resources and increases output early on. Now the reason things come back down again is basically private debt levels, that some of the income people have is then being used to repay the debt rather than going into anything say productive, and that acts as a drag on growth later on in the period. I think the question you're raising, I think, is it possible that we could put the economy on a different long-term growth trajectory, which is really interesting one, because I mean, some people would say it's sort of the opposite of what we managed to do now and put the economy permanently onto a lower growth trajectory, with investment being far below what we would hope for. And that's a difficult question, because it's all about how can we permanently change expectations to induce additional investment. Now, the econometrics in the model says probably not, things do revert back in the long term. But there are limits to econometrics for sure. I'm not a cheerleader for econometrics by any means. So possibly we should think about that outside the modeling framework as well, to see what might it take to permanently change expectations, or even just to get them back towards something that's more a trend rate of, say, 2.5% growth a year rather than 1 or closer to where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Hector. Jens, do you have anything to comment on that question? You're muted.
No, not really, Asger. No.
Just fine. I would like to pick up on the debt issue and the financial sector, as Hector just touched upon. I myself, as a PhD student, I'm studying green finance, and with the assumption that we cannot take the financial sector for granted, maybe because I grew up in the time of the great financial crash and all this. And there's also a whole literature building on the issue of climate-related financial risk and the fear of stranded assets that could spill over into the financial sector and wider to the wider economy, as central banks are increasingly embracing this as defining this as an issue. How do you think about that in your models, the financial sector, both in terms of providing the finance for the investments and also as a source of risk?
Yep, challenging question. As a source of finance for investment, yes. I mean, the basic ideas for investment to happen, there has to be a company and b a financer that thinks there is a high enough rate of return to make it worthwhile. That's some of it comes through the econometric equation, some of it comes from the technology modeling, but the econometrics picks up over history again the trends for when this might and might not happen based on so growth rates and rates of return. So that part is included in there. Now, of course, the problem is it operates in what we might call normal times, but as soon as things get interesting, all these relationships change, and at that point we just can't rely on the equations anymore. Now, we have been trying to look at this through more of a scenario-based approach, and the question of stranded assets is key, because the model can determine sort of what the value of all these assets will be, but it's not so good at saying what happens when everybody suddenly realizes there's a huge loss of value in the system, and then we're in highly nonlinear territory. So again, we just have to look at assumptions and design scenarios for a range of possible outcomes. It's not particularly satisfactory, and I think if we wanted to go further, we need to have a better micro-based approach, say an agent-based system working within the model, but I think there's still quite a lot of difficulties there.
Thank you. And Jens, do you have a perspective on this?
If you're perhaps we are even more extreme than Hector's model is in that we assume that finance is readily available through the international market, right? It's probably not what you would have thought before this presentation, Asger, I would guess, but that's the assumption anyway, and it builds on the same premise really that if there are profitable investments, firms will undertake them, and finance will stand ready, right? And the question of stranded assets, I mean, firms have a value in our model, right? And it's what's it called, discounted value of future profits and so on, right? So if we introduce a future carbon tax on cement production, for instance, it will run down the value of the firm, and stocks would be hit, and we would get sort of wealth income effects by that way, and so it's there. And if you look at our agriculture sector, it's a real big deal, and it's something that we're thinking hard about. Like if we put a tax on on agricultural production. As the model is right now, it would predict that that it will set off a huge fall in the price of agricultural land, and then new farmers would someone would, in reality, some farmers would go bankrupt, and other new farmers would buy up the land and so on, and that's the case of stranded assets really. But these problems are, I mean, of people going bankrupt is not really, it's not really well captured in the model, but it's clear to see that is what's happening, and it will also be clear for policy makers or people using the model that this is a concern that the model perhaps not describes that well. So yeah.
So that the land you're mentioning, the falling land values, that's collateral for a lot of bank loans and realkredit bond loans in the Danish financial sector. Are you capturing the dynamics, that the knock-on effects that if the collateral quality declines?
Probably not as well as one could hope, but it's clear that it's a concern, and you have to deal with that when designing policy. So I'm not sure that we really need to capture effects like that in the model. It's clear that it's a concern, and it would. I don't think that policymakers would be misled into thinking that that is not a problem. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Let's jump to the next question from the audience. Adam has a question on to Hector regarding the Lucas critique. Adam, would you like to state it with audio? You're permitted to talk.
It's just as I written, Hector comment on the Lucas critique going back a long time now on the need really for micro foundations and models, and the issue with using sort of historical data and around expectations and so on. I'm sure there is a response to this, but I'd just be interested in hearing it. Thank you.
Yeah, so Lucas critique is very real. It's something that we can't deny, something that we have to live with. It's Lucas critique applies. In our training courses that we run at Cambridge Econometrics, I've been saying for about a decade that the Lucas critique applies to the parameters in any kind of model, not just a econometric model. And I seem to be the only person in the world that was saying this. And until I think two years ago, I saw Andy Haldane and Arthur Terrell managed to put this in a paper in the Oxford Journal. So it is now official that it applies to parameters in all models, not just me saying that. It is more important for econometric models though, because it has a bigger role within the model formulation. Now, as I already mentioned, econometrics I see as the least bad way of parameterizing the model. Wherever we can find a better way to do it, then we do. The technology modeling is a great example. I mean, way back when I started doing this, we had econometric equations for the power sector, and they were pretty bad, to be honest, because first of all, the data is very lumpy, because when a new power station opens, there's a jump in the data, it just skews the econometrics. But also the questions we were asking were about solar and wind, things that we just didn't have historical data for. So the whole situation has changed, and we need an alternative approach. So in general, we go with econometrics because it gives the best estimate that we have. It's non-biased, and as we go forward, usually in most cases we don't have a better way of doing it without building an entire submodel to replace every equation. But we do have to acknowledge the uncertainty around this, and the further forward we go in time, so beyond 2030, and the further we go away from the baseline position, which means anything with a transition in it, then the more or the less robust the results become. And we just have to be humble and acknowledge that there is no way around it.
Thanks, Hector. I'll pass it on to Søren Have, who has a question about green, what growth actually means in these models, and whether we can use other indicators. Søren, can I find you here? you should now be allowed to talk.
Yeah. So my question is, I mean, not being an economist, I've learned that growth is not always what people think it is, and people actually use various definitions. And usually, as I understand it, it's referring to kind of GDP growth. And I assume, and this question was typed when Jens was presenting. So my question is mainly to Jens, or because there's also been work in Denmark on a green GDP, whether that's the one being used, and then also, as I understood, the model is kind of calculating forwards, given some assumptions. Then how do we? What will this mean to the 1.5 limit temperature? But can the model also be used, kind of calculating backwards, optimizing policy within a certain planetary boundaries?
Jens, you are unmuted. Would you like to?
Yeah, let's start with the last question about the boundaries. I try to say that to begin with, that we don't really model the direct interaction between like the global temperature level and economic circumstances in Denmark, and it has to do with we're on a different time frame really, that we want to model climate policy while the implication, and that's like within these next few decades, that's what's going on, and so that's what we focus on, while climate changes are more long term. And I'm not sure that also, I mean, if there was real good clear estimations of how, or measures on how on exactly how a change in Danish emissions would affect future temperatures, and how that would reflect back on Danish economy. I mean, we could in theory build that into the model, but it's...
You could perhaps have a carbon budget reflecting the 1.5 limit.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so if that's the one way to, how should I say, to account for it, yeah, we could do that. I mean, we can easily make a carbon budget and see how we go along with that, and we could investigate how to best design policy to meet some target like that. That's basically what the model is being built for, I guess. But about how do we measure growth? It's the project that you mentioned with the green GDP project. It's actually part of the same research project that Peter Birch Sørensen formulated. So it's actually in a way an integral part of this whole project. But it's the green GDP project, at least for now, it's statistical in the way that we try to make a statistical green GDP growth. And I don't know, perhaps when that's well established and everything, we could sort of integrate it into a model like ours. But at the moment, when we measure economic activity, we use the standard GDP measure, and then we make separate accounts for emissions and everything else. We don't try to weigh things together like that. Yeah. If that's where we were heading, then it's up to you as a user or the policy maker to evaluate GDP against other measures.
Cool.
Great.
That answers.
Thank you for the question. I think if you're all right with it, Jens and Hector, I'd like to have one final question before we finish off. Excellent. Lucas Krebel from the New Economics Foundation. Let me see if I can invite you to speak as well. He has a question on the role of monetary policy. As we know, renewable energy installations are very capital intensive, high capex opex ratio. So monetary policy should, in theory, have more influence on green investments and other types of energy technologies. So I think this is a really good question here. Lucas, do you want to state it?
Hi, thanks. I hope you can hear me. So thanks for very interesting presentations and a good discussion. Yes, so as I put in the chat here, I would like to, if we could tell a bit more about like how you input like monetary policy variables to your models. So like I suppose interest rates or inflation, like do you make an assumptions and do you like assume say like a constant path of those, or do you allow for like, you know, the policy change again, like big more dynamic? For example, like now we are moving towards all this. There's a lot of talk about green finance and some early action by central banks to potentially adjust the monetary policy frameworks to favor green investments or to penalize potentially the dirty ones. So not much has happened in practice yet, but this is the direction of travel. So yeah, I would be just very curious if you could tell me like how it works for your modeling. Thank you.
Thanks. Who would like to answer it first?
Yeah, I can do. Thanks for the question. I'm not sure what you've done to Frank. So, I assume he's there somewhere. I mean, we've got really ambitious climate targets. We need to get to net zero. We need to throw everything we can at it, including monetary variables. It's not something we've looked at in that much detail, but it is something that sits there in the model, and reducing the interest rates on green investments will accelerate deployment. I don't think the tool on its own is powerful enough to change the direction of technology, although that is an empirical question, but I think it will at least accelerate it, and for sure there's no harm in doing it. Again, it comes back, it's sort of similar to the question on carbon taxes. It's an instrument within the toolkit. It won't cover the whole of the innovation cycle, but when you get towards the end of it and you've got competing technologies within the market, then it is something that could make a difference, and that's the role I would see. So as long as you don't use it as a substitute for regulatory and fiscal policy, but as a complement, then very much I say there are potential big advantages.
Jens,
would you like to comment on this issue as well?
Yeah, but I mean, the place where we are at, we are just struggling building our model right now. So we are not thinking too carefully about our policies like that. And generally, I think what's it called? What we really need to focus on is getting good estimates of future technologies. At what cost do they come in, and what are the real barriers and all that stuff. And that's and all these the options and the constraints to move forward, right? And if this is one of them, it's worth looking at, but it's not on our radar right now.
Excellent. I would just like to say thanks both to Jens and to Hector. This has been amazing, learning what it looks like at the frontier of green economic modeling. We've learned about the strengths and the weaknesses of two different traditions in modeling, but we've also experienced that there are some kind of convergence, I believe, between the two modes. You didn't get into that much of a fight in terms of principles and such. So there seems like there's a common trajectory in green modeling, which is encouraging from the public's view, because we are really depending on getting these models right. So I'd like everybody to give a big round of applause. I'm not sure you'll be able to hear it, but thank you so much, both of you, for coming. This has been extraordinary. Thank you.
Thank you, Asger, for organizing it. It was a real pleasure.
Yes, thank you for having us.
And everybody, hope you will enjoy your weekend and think about green macroeconomic models. Bye, everybody.